Church family, I'm here with Dottie Moran. Hello, Dottie. How are you?
Good.
Dottie works with us in our business office, is one of our associates there. She's actually worked a lot of things at our church these last few years. She's done housekeeping. She still works at First Academy and our nursery and things of that nature. So we're having a sermon about money today, and I wanted to ask you about it. So one of the things, you're one of our many success stories at Samaritan Inn. Tell us a little bit about what led you to come to the Samaritan Inn and how that worked for your family.
Well, I was informed wrong as a child. You know, they teach you to, those are my bills, that's my car payment and things like that. So you forget, actually you learn that when you go to Sam Inn that you're supposed to be a good steward of money and that it's actually God's money, even though it doesn't say it's his bill.
So how was your time there in Samaritan Inn? What are some things that the Lord taught you?
Just how to really budget and get more than one job if you've got more than one kids, and you know, with inflation and things like that, how to just really make it all work.
I noticed right away you were such a hard worker and still are, and that you weren't afraid to hustle even with two teenagers at home or two younger kids. And how do you value, what kind of role and value do you put on just work, just getting out there and getting it done?
Well, you look at the elephant and you just eat it, you know, one bite at a time, and just knowing that I'm also showing my children how to be, you know, good, productive individuals as well.
One of the things too that I can see in your life is that you have received much, you know, blessings and help, and generally the impulse as one walks with God is that you want to give as you've received. Mm-hmm. What kind of role has giving and generosity played in your own life?
Giving is not only good for yourself, but it's our way of being a true reflection of Christ, which is what we want people to see in us. You know, we want them to see that we are, you know, a good steward, a reflection of Christ, because sometimes in the world, we may be the only glimpse that they see of it.
How challenging is, as a single mother and working hard, to be faithful to give and honor the Lord with what he's given you?
I mean, I've got a couple of gray hairs worrying over it, but I think it's also the good chance for us to remember, just leave it at God's feet. You know, we don't need a whole lot. God will definitely take care of all the basics.
Do you have any words of encouragement for someone out there who may have really never been generous to the Lord and struggling to say, can I really trust God with my finances in that regard? What encouragement would you give to them?
Let go and let God. You can't outgive God. You just can't. And if you think you can, just try.
Thanks, Dottie, for sharing with us today. We really appreciate you, sister.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I mean, the only thing worse than a sermon on money is a sermon on money with the heater not working, huh? Goodness. I wasn't sure if it was going to be me and my dear bride, just the two of us, but here you are. I imagine our online numbers are increasing today. And I don't think in all 18 and a half years I've been here, I've worn jeans on a Sunday morning, but I just wanted to, you know, sort of bundle up. And another reason I did it is because my mother doesn't watch me anymore, so I figured I wouldn't hear from her about it. But welcome. We're glad all you guys are here today. I don't know if you've heard of a person named James Donalds or Donaldson. Your grandkids have, but they know him by a different name. And he is the most famous YouTuber in the world. His name is Mr. Beast. By the way, what is a YouTuber? You know, it's interesting. What do you want to be when you grow up? Most of you probably said fireman, policeman, professional athlete. That's what I said back in the day. If you ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? They will say, I want to be a professional gamer, meaning video games, or I want to be a YouTuber, which is someone that earns a living by posting videos on the platform YouTube. But the one with the most followers in the world is a man by the name of Mr. Beast. And he's what you kind of refer to as a shock philanthropist. He has a bunch of videos where he tries to get people and challenge them to do these wild, crazy things. And in doing so, they will earn money. And oftentimes he's very benevolent to certain causes he finds worthy. He's also the host of a game show that has the largest kitty in the history of game shows. You remember the $64,000 question? Well, no one's going to play for $64,000 anymore. He has a show called The Beast Games that has a winnings of $5 million for the winner. And there's 1,000 contestants on the show. The reason I'm bringing this up today is because I read an article about a waiver you have to sign in order to be one of the 1,000 contestants competing for $5 million. They ask you questions such as, are you okay with being thrown out of a helicopter into the ocean? And can you swim back to shore if that happened to you? And you have to basically, you know the fine print on things? That one of the things says, you might die on this show. Do you consent to dying, essentially? And you got people looking at the bottom line, $5 million? Sure, yeah, I guess I'll risk death for $5 million. I'm looking out at this crowd today, and y'all don't seem real convinced that's worth it, right? But it is interesting what motivates human beings financially. We don't get a sane view of money by listening to the world and looking at the way the system operates. And frankly, well, let me put it to you this way. Do you have a friend or a family member or someone in your life or that used to be in your life that you didn't like what they had to say to you, but you knew you needed to hear it? This is kind of how Jesus is in our lives when it comes to money. We may not like exactly how he says it or even what he says, but if we're going to be his follower, we basically need to hear it. And nobody talks to us about these things like Jesus does. And so we're in a sermon series on the parables, and Christ is in the middle in Luke chapter 12 of what we refer to as the Lucan Sermon on the Mount. Christ's teaching that we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount are primarily found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But there's a summary of that sermon in Luke's gospel. And it contains some things that aren't found in Matthew's gospel. So Christ is talking about things like hypocrisy, persecution, some beatitudes. He's talking about the importance of not worrying and trusting in him. And while he is talking, there's somebody that kind of moves to the front of the line and puts their hand up and asks a question. And the question he has is a financial one, which Christ basically doesn't receive his question very well. Then Christ gives a warning about money and then launches into a rather memorable story of the parable of the rich fool. And as we look at it today, we're going to leave, Lord willing, with a healthier view of money than we came in here with. Maybe you're familiar with this story and have been practicing these principles, but all of us, you might say, could use a refresher on money from Jesus' perspective. Let's look at verse 13 of Luke 12 and 14, where it says this: someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Now, this question is as random as it sounds. As I mentioned, Jesus teaching a sermon and someone interrupts. Now, some of you were school teachers. Some of you might have been professors, or you've taught before, or given speeches or lectures or things of that nature. And one of the things that is important, if in certain settings, if it's a lecture situation, there's not a Q&A. If you go to Sunday school after this, many of our classes, there's discussion time, there's questions, small group Bible studies and things of that nature. Everybody chime in. Hands are encouraged to go up. But not in moments like this in the crowd. And a matter of fact, you may have been trying to teach sometime and someone asked a question that's way out in left field, and therefore your lecture went out there as well. I remember one time my brother-in-law, who is retired, he and my sister are retired here in Leesburg, was at our church in Texas before we came here years ago, and they were missionaries in Africa. And he was going to speak to the kids during vacation Bible school. And he said, "Cliff, what should I tell them?" I said, "Well, why don't you tell them what God's doing in your ministry, but maybe tell them a story as an attention getter." And he told a story about a camel that lived in Northeast Africa that was a very aggressive camel. And the people used to give him cigars and cigarettes. And he got so aggressive whenever he would see someone smoking, he would go over and grab them out of their mouth. I don't think he told them this part, but they had to put the camel down. But anyway, he didn't tell him that part, but he told him about the smoking camel in Djibouti, and East Africa was the name of the country, Djibouti. That's kind of funny in and of itself, but anyway. And then he told them the story, and he goes, all right, well, let me tell you some things going on in our ministry. We do this and this and this. Guys, got any questions? They're like, hey, what happened to that camel? Oh, well, da, 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 da. And then, any other questions? Hey, does the camel also drink beer? Every question was about the camel. Now, he brought that on himself, with my advice, I suppose. Jesus didn't bring this on himself, but things are way off track. And the first principle we see about a healthy look of money is number one on your outline, and that's this: resist telling Jesus what to do. Notice the way the man phrased it. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Do you think he said, Jesus, would you do me a favor? Would you look at our situation and render a fair verdict, whatever you decide is fine? That's not how it went, was it? Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Well, this is given in a command form to Jesus. You and I don't have the moxie to look Christ in the eye and order him around and tell him what to do. But we certainly need to be in the listening posture rather than the telling posture. You see, in those days, let me raise your hand if you're the firstborn, either an only child or the firstborn. Are you out there? All you meanies out there? Okay. Well, the firstborn, especially the firstborn male in this first century culture, not only got a double portion of the, if you had 5 siblings, you divided it 6 ways, 2 portions for the firstborn, and then the firstborn himself was to distribute the goods to everyone else. Sometimes, have you ever heard of a slow distribution of funds? Sometimes the firstborn would get into that mode. Well, you know what? Your part is gone. I'm sorry about that. There's nothing left. That kind of thing. This sounds like a brother that felt jilted. Was it an important concern to him? Yes. But notice this. This wasn't Jesus' concern. Making sure that you got your fair share of what was owed you. He said, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? This, to some, sounds like one of the more calloused things Jesus said. Because we're told, in the verses like, present your request to God, pray about everything in Philippians 4:6, whatever's on your heart, he cares about. Does that include this? Because he basically says, that's not me. Now, I don't think we want to read too much into this. If you have trouble with your finances, if you're having trouble beating your money from your mean older brother or sister, you can talk to Jesus about it and he's not going to blow you off. But there's an interesting leadership principle in here. Some of you have maybe been in a position in an organization before, and you had your marching orders on what you needed to do to get the job done, but you notice everyone else had lesser items for you to take care of as well. And there's only so much diversion you can do before your main mission is thwarted and off course because you tended to the lesser issues. This is one of those moments in Christ's ministry. He wasn't here to get into property wars with feuding siblings. He was here to redeem the souls of mankind. He also was making a distinction here. Many called him rabbi because he was a teacher. And it actually was the role of rabbis in local synagogues to help with family disputes, even financial ones. But Jesus was implying, I'm not a local synagogue rabbi. I'm actually the living Son of God who will pay for the sins of the world and will rise in victory over the grave. So Christ was focused on his mission. And when it comes to money things, we should be, Lord, what you've entrusted to me is in your hands. I want your directions for how to use it. And if I'm short on funds or if I'm flushed with funds, I want to be listening to God's word rather than saying, Jesus, let me tell you what I'm going to do for me, and maybe I'll throw in a little for you. We need to enter into listening mode when it comes to Jesus and money. Now, Christ went into if you didn't know the context, you would think, man, what is he so worked up about? In verse 15, it says this, and he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. This leads to the second principle this morning about a healthy look at money, and that's this: never lose sight of money's danger. I know in messages like that, some people are going, you know what, I guess every so often we have to endure the preacher telling us that stay away from money because money is bad. And if that's the message you've gotten somewhere, you've gotten the wrong message. Jesus is not saying anything about the morality of money in and of itself. He doesn't say, be on your guard because money's bad. He says, be on your guard because money is dangerous. There's a dark side to money itself that Christ gives us. First of all, he says in verse 15, take care. It means don't be careless, be careful. I appreciated what Dottie, our church employee, said in the video, that she was just basically handling money without thought or carefulness. And Christ says when it comes to financial issues, be very careful. Then he says this, be on your guard. This is a military term that describes vigilant defense because there's an enemy. It would be like a commanding officer saying, the enemy's coming, so be very careful. It's interesting, the things that we're taught to be careful of. Remember when your mom said, be home early because nothing good happens after dark? Remember how you were told to be careful on July 4th and New Year's Eve, and when the crazies are out and about, be careful of those things. We're hosting some family in this weekend for a friend's wedding. That's one of my kids' friends getting married this weekend. And we were hearing a story about one of my daughter-in-laws that lives in Texas, and they were on a walk. She and my son and their 1-year-old were on a walk, and they went around the corner, and a pit bull was off his leash and bit the leg of my sweet, sweet daughter-in-law. They showed us a picture of the bite that I could have done without seeing. And guess what they do? They don't go on that street anymore. It's one of those things you fear in the wild, that this could happen to you. Yes, be afraid of bears if you're in the mountains, and be careful, right? Take the bear spray, learn how to handle them. Hey, take care if a pit bull's around the corner. But can you imagine Jesus saying, be careful, watch out, because there's really something evil, and it's what? Covetousness. Notice the word in front of covetousness is the word all. Can I have just a scooch of greed and covetousness? No, beware of all of it. Now, covetousness is essentially, it's been defined of intense desire for something you have enough of already. Some of you might say, well, I don't think you understand my finances. I don't quite have enough. And it's not saying that we shouldn't work harder and be wiser to use God's resources better and, when necessary, to acquire more effort at getting more funds. It's just saying the desire for more is where covetousness comes in. And matter of fact, Paul referred to covetousness in Colossians 3:5 as idolatry. And be on guard against greed. Put off greed or covetousness because it is idolatry. So covetousness is essentially such high devotion to stuff and things that it becomes godlike in your heart. The problem with covetousness is as if one's life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possessions. Do we know that? Yeah, we know that. But do we live as if this house, this car, this thing is what defines me? My life. Now, our life can be enhanced with certain blessings that we have, of course, but that's not what life consists of. Life does not consist in having more of this or that, and Christ was so clear. Matter of fact, I would challenge you, especially when you sense there's struggle in this area, to put Luke 12:15 to memory. Now, as I've said before, Christ was a master at taking a moment and telling a story to bring his point home. And so he tells a story to an agrarian community that many of them could relate to. And it gives us the third principle about a healthy view of money. Number 2 is to never lose sight of money's danger. But number 3 is to battle self-centered habits. In verse 16, and he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. By the way, how he says it is not to deride his plenty. He's not saying, hey, look out for having a lot of stuff, because that's bad in and of itself. He's saying, watch out when you have a lot of stuff and your stuff becomes the thing. And in verse 17, and he said to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? Have you ever thought to yourself, or maybe even said, my biggest problem is I don't have enough money, and if I only had more money, everything would be okay? Well, that great theologian, the deceased rapper Notorious B.I.G. once said the phrase, mo money, mo problems. Anybody ever tasted that before? That's what Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes 5:10. Whoever loves money never has money enough. And when your goods increase, so do those who want to consume them. Do you know who gets the most calls from old friends and family? Is lottery winners. All of a sudden you interview lottery winners and they'll tell you that was the worst thing that ever happened to them. So he sounds stressed out about his success. Christ does not deride the man for his success, but he notes that the money brings anxiety and pressure, now, when you and I have money stress, it should lead us to be men and women of prayer. But this led this man to be a man of anxiety that became more and more self-centered in verse 18. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Sounds like this man called a board meeting with the 3 members of his board, me, myself, and I. And you can see the problem here is he had self-centered money habits because he thought that everything good that happened to him was because of him. I was listening to a message by Pastor H.B. Charles this week from Jacksonville, and he said, we should never forget that what we know God taught us and where we are, God brought us. Maybe you are a successful person and you've forgotten that the reason you're successful was because God gave you the strength to be successful. I worked hard, you might say. Well, you worked hard because God gave you the strength to work hard. He gave you the mind to be able to do the hard work and the hands to put your hands to the wheel and the plow and never let up. And this person began to think of no one else but himself. And in verse 19, his retirement plan was fully intact. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So essentially, he didn't say, I've got these goods. I can do a lot of good to help out the people of God, to help out the poor. Yes, this person could have been mega generous and still be rich and have so much joy flowing from the generosity. Instead, his anxiety, notice he didn't just build more barns. Nothing wrong with building bigger barns, but he tore down the barns he had and built other ones. In other words, he made weird financial decisions because of his wealth. He didn't think about prudence, wisdom. Maybe someone else could use those barns, or I could use them for good for something. No, just get rid of them and buy bigger and better and just stack it to the teeth, and everything's going to be okay about my future. Self-centeredness with money can lead us to obsess about the future and approach it with very little wisdom. Of course, no one should read into this and assume Christ is implying there is fault with preparation. There's nothing in the Bible that would forbid preparing for your future financially. Matter of fact, there's a good bit in Proverbs about saving and wise investing that would lead us to, in a God-honoring way, prepare for the future and be thrifty with funds. But the problem is, you notice something in verses 16 through 19. There is no mention of others, and there is no mention, most importantly, of God. Therefore, God inserts himself into the story. In our study of parables, we've seen Jesus represent God as a king, as a shepherd, as a father. There's a character that kind of plays God. But what Jesus does in this parable reminds me of an Alfred Hitchcock movie or a Stan Lee movie in Spider-Man. You know what those two directors did that was unique to their movies is that they always gave a very brief cameo. So you'd have big old Alfred Hitchcock in one small scene in his movies, and there he is. And same with Stan Lee, who made the Spider-Man. There's Stan Lee just walking down the street. Well, rather than disguise God in some other character, God makes an appearance as, quote, himself. He appears himself in verse 20 and says, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you've prepared, whose will they be?'" How do you think that this man liked the intro that God gave him? Fool. Was he used to being called a fool? I'd say by his employees, he was called Sir, yes, sir. By his competitors, he was known as maybe a ruthless, but certainly a big businessman. By his mother, she was probably my sweet baby rich boy. By his wife, no telling what his wife said about him. But she certainly knew him to be at least a very good provider. His kids probably loved the fact that their daddy was a big shot. The biggest barns in Jerusalem. Everybody generally said good things about this person except for one person, and that was God. God had one adjective for him, and that was fool, which means senseless and non-thinking. So, I guess one of the points for us is this. If everybody else has something good to say about you except God, that should concern us. Everybody else says you're this, and this, and God says, you know what? I think you're a fool. You might want to listen closely to what God says of you and make the proper adjustments. Now, why was he a fool? Not because he was rich, not because he was successful. Well, because he left God out of his plans and didn't practice kindness, generosity with what God had given him. Also, he couldn't tell time. This night your soul's required of you. Remember in verse 19? Eat, drink, and be merry, which was a biblical idiom for basically self-centered, indulgent living. Nothing wrong with eating, drinking, and being merry. It's just that those should not comprise what life is about. And this man thought he had all the time in the world. Well, the very night he said those things, this night, I read an article that kids in our day, in our iPhone digital culture, can no longer tell time on a normal clock. I still have distinct memories of in grade school seeing the big hand and the little hand. Remember that on the wall, and you're taught in first grade or whatever. This is how you tell time. And yeah, those clocks are a little bit weird to think about all those numbers. You have to learn your multiples of 5 pretty fast. And I'm not saying poor kids can't read a clock. Things are horrible. We'll rise above it, right? But at some point, we should learn to tell time. And spiritually, we've got to learn to tell time by God's timetable. And say, time is not in my hands. Time's in God's hands. Yeah, we don't know our future. Yeah, life is brief. And so I want to do things that honor Him. That's number 4 in your outline. A healthy look at money involves remembering the brevity of life. Life is brief. Life is a vapor. Life is a mist. And it vanishes for a while. Instead, James says, we ought to say, if God wills, we're going to live and do this or that. We don't know if God wills, we're going to live. But if He does will, we're going to live, and I'm going to live for Him. I'm not going to take life in my own hands and assume that I call the shots for my life, because life is brief and life is in the hands of the one true God. Now notice the antidote here. It says this, so the one who lays up treasure for himself So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. I think most of us are encouraged when we have a problem that has a simple solution. You ever had a problem where the solution was real complicated? That kind of stuff's no fun. I remember I was surprised at how simple. This was probably probably 15 years ago. Every winter for my first 3 or 4 years being here, I would have 3 or 4 Sundays where I'm going, "Good morning, welcome to First Baptist Leesburg." And one of the deacons who was the head of the search committee that brought me here came to my office, and I was in my office, my secretary, and he said to my assistant, "Dottie, I'd like you to call this number." And so she was like, "Yes, sir." She's going the number. And it was an ENT. It was an ear, nose, and throat specialist. And it was saying, she's on the phone. "Why am I calling him?" "Get an appointment for Pastor Cliff." And I'm going, "Say what?" So the head deacon got me an appointment and actually made me go to the doctor to look at my throat. And I'm going, I'm fine. It's just winter, right? And I'm going to use my voice a lot. And I go to the doctor, and they take a look at my throat and say, "Oh, you got acid reflux." And I said, "Who's that?" I said, "Take this and it'll be fine." I took a few of the things, and I was like, I was an opera singer by the end of the week, It's one of those deals where it's not the end of the world. It's a pretty simple solution. So Christ has remember now the context. The guy said, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance." He goes, "That's not me. By the way, watch out, because greed's like a pit bull that wants to bite you." And the rich fool is the guy that only looked out for himself. And life is brief. God requires our soul from us on the night we least expect it. So we're going, okay, well, how do we handle this big beast, this animal called greed that wants to bite us? Well, there's 2 simple ways in verse 21. Don't lay up treasure for yourself, meaning don't live without God in view. Don't make life and the area of money something where you take your own advice. And then he says, and be rich toward God. Rich meaning abundance of something, and God being the benevolent one that has given us, and so we are to give back to Him. Now, many of us wish that Jesus would have been more specific. What does it mean to be rich toward God? And I sometimes get people asking me, is it okay for me to have this? And how should I approach this? Well, we know that God gives us training wheels in Scripture. The training wheels of giving in the Old Testament was the tithe. And 10% of your income. And some people go, well, that's not really spelled out in the New Testament. Shouldn't I be a grace giver instead of a percentage giver? And I'm like, well, maybe so. It's not totally clarified, but it seems like the percentage are God's training wheels. I remember getting the training wheels off and riding the bike for myself, teaching my sons to ride the bike for themselves. It's a kind of a fun fly. All I know is that giving to the Lord, to His work, giving to those in need, is the best greed valve, is the best drain valve for greed that exists. If we want to be people that aren't in love with stuff, whose life is not craving more and more and more, we've got to learn to be, quote, rich toward God. Susie and I both came from families that practice giving. And so when we got married, it wasn't like we were going to say, should we give to the church, should we give to the Lord or not? We were going to do it. It was something we wanted to do, something we enjoyed to do. But then we had these things we never had called our own bills before. And then we became collectors of children. I'm like, shouldn't we collect hats or something or coins? No, we're collecting boys. And all of a sudden, we're people that love to give with a whole lot of responsibility, a whole lot of bills. Well, what do? Well, you know what we did? We kept giving even when it hurt. And you can imagine it hurt sometimes. You're sitting there looking at the budget and you're going, well, we got this, let's give. And we have zero regrets about giving. We didn't always give, perfectly, but we always gave intentionally. We always tried to let God push us into more generosity, and the joy is something that flows out of generosity. Matter of fact, I want to encourage you this morning, 2 Corinthians 8:7, Paul says, just as you exceed in love, faithfulness, he mentioned several things. He says, also excel in this grace of giving. Paul told the Corinthians, make sure that whatever point you are in generosity, to grow into becoming more and more generous. Sometimes as we worry more about the future and about money, our hands get a little more tighter grip around what God's given us. And Paul says, excel in the grace of giving. Be a loose-handed person with what God has entrusted to you. The fifth principle this morning about a healthy look at money is this: keep progressing in Godward generosity. Now the scripture says in 2 Corinthians 8:9, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. What does that mean? Through the poverty of Jesus, becoming a man, dying on the cross for our sins, rising in victory from the grave, when we admit our spiritual poverty, that we need a relationship with Jesus, we become spiritually rich by faith in Christ. There's a great message no matter where you are in your spiritual journey today. And I'd like us, as we reflect on this message, to take a moment and bow together. And as we're bowed together and entering into a time of response, our missions and discipleship pastor Chris Lowe is going to come and lead us in a time of invitation this morning.